The morning of the Willowbrook Harvest Festival dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crisp air that sharpened the colors of every leaf and blade of grass. Sunlight fell kindly upon the village green, where trestle tables had been erected, bunting strung between chestnut trees, and stalls laden with jams, cakes, and vegetables stood ready to be judged. The church bells chimed gaily, calling not to service but to 5-2 celebration. For this was the most important day of the year in Willowbrook, when the whole village gathered to show its produce, gossip, and most importantly measure itself against its neighbors. By 10 o'clock the green was thronged with villagers. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Prowse, bustling from stall to stall, tried to make certain that every tablecloth was neatly spread and every bouquet displayed to advantage. Mr. Hawkins, the stout grocer, presided over a stack of prize-winning marrows, each larger than a child. Children ran shrieking between the booths, clutching toffee apples already sticky in their hands. It was, in short, a picture of English village life at its most charming. Miss Jane Marple, recently arrived from St. Mary Mead to visit her cousin Mrs. Caroline Pierce, stood quietly by the edge of the green, her lace-gloved hands folded over her handbag. At 80, she was no longer robust enough to bustle about, but she possessed the keen eyes of one who observed more than most. She watched with mild amusement as a young woman in a flowered frock whispered something to her neighbor, and both dissolved into knowing laughter. In every parish, Miss Marple reflected, the fete was less about the vegetables than about the people who paraded them. At the center of the gathering stood Sir Geoffrey Blunt, a tall, broad man with a florid face. He was dressed in country tweeds of a cut rather too youthful for him. As the principal landowner of Willowbrook, he had appointed himself patron of the festival. He strode about the green with an air of command, slapping men on the back, bestowing compliments, and occasionally delivering a stinging remark disguised as humor. "Fine turnips, Briggs," he boomed, pausing at a stall. "Pity you can't grow your cabbages as well. Still, one mustn't expect miracles from poor soil." The farmer to whom this was addressed flushed crimson, but muttered only, "Yes, Sir Geoffrey." Miss Marple, watching, thought how very like human nature it was that a man with so many advantages should delight in belittling others. She saw the tightening of the farmer's jaw and the look in his eyes. She had seen it before, in a maid accused of stealing when she had not, in a girl jilted by a thoughtless suitor. Resentment was a dangerous seed. At 11 o'clock the cider competition commenced. Willowbrook prided itself on its orchards, and the barrels rolled onto the green were a source of fierce rivalry. A table was set with tankards, and Sir Geoffrey, of course, had taken the chair of judge. He relished the role, sniffing each cup with exaggerated solemnity, rolling the liquid on his tongue, and pronouncing in tones that brooked no contradiction. "This one's too sour. That one lacks body. Quite acceptable, though hardly distinguished." The villagers gathered round, laughing politely, though some shifted uneasily at his manner. Miss Marple, standing just behind the vicar's wife, observed the scene. She noticed a maid from the Blunt household hovering at the edge of the crowd, her eyes darting nervously toward her master. She saw, too, that the farmer Thomas Briggs, stiffly with his arms folded, glaring at the proceedings. Sir Geoffrey lifted the final tankard, raised it high, and declared, "To the glory of Willowbrook cider." With a flourish he drank deeply. What followed seemed, at first, a mere accident. Sir Geoffrey coughed, choked, and set down the tankard with a clatter. His face darkened to an alarming purple. He clutched at his throat, gasped once more, and then collapsed heavily across the table, sending cups and cider sloshing onto the grass. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the green erupted in confusion. Women shrieked, men pressed forward, children were pulled hastily aside. The doctor, A thin, harassed-looking man named Dr. Leonard pushed through the throng and bent over the fallen man. "I fear it's too late. He is gone." The words fell like stones into a well. Murmurs rose at once. Heart attack? Poison? How sudden! Who would have thought? Mrs. Prowse wrung her hands. Oh, the poor man! To die so suddenly at the festival of all places. Not so poor, muttered Briggs bitterly, but he was hushed by those nearby. The inspector, Mr. Graves, arrived soon after, summoned by a boy sent running to the constable's house. He was a thick-set man with an air of official certainty. After a brief examination, he turned to the gathering crowd. "There will be no more festivities today. Everyone go home. This is now a matter for the police." The villagers dispersed reluctantly, still whispering. Miss Marple walked slowly beside her cousin Caroline, who was pale and shaken. "A dreadful thing, Jane, simply dreadful. To think of poor Sir Geoffrey struck down like that." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Yes, dear, very dreadful." Though, she paused, her blue eyes thoughtful, perhaps not wholly unexpected. Caroline looked startled. "Why, whatever do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled faintly, adjusting her gloves. "One sees so much, you know, in villages. Human nature has a way of repeating itself, whether in St. Mary Mead or in Willowbrook, and Sir Geoffrey was—" "Not without his enemies," Caroline gasped. "Jane, you don't mean murder?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she looked back at the green, where the cider barrel still stood abandoned, the bunting fluttering forlornly in the breeze. The gaiety of the morning had dissolved into a shadow that would not easily lift. And in that shadow, Miss Marple knew, lay secrets waiting to be uncovered. By the next morning, Willowbrook had settled into that peculiar hush which falls upon a village after sudden tragedy. The bunting still flapped limply across the green, and the trestle tables stood forlorn, stripped of their produce and prizes. A toppled toffee apple stick lay in the dust, and 1 or 2 cider barrels had been left abandoned at the edge of the square, mute reminders of the shocking scene. But though the green was quiet, the village itself was not. Behind curtains, in kitchens and shops, tongues wagged furiously. At Mrs. Hawkins's grocery, a cluster of women pressed together among the shelves of flour and jam, speaking in urgent whispers. "Dead before he hit the ground, they say," declared Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, her voice pitched low but full of relish. "Dr. Leonard couldn't do a thing. Purple as a plum, he was." "It's the heart, I'm sure," insisted Mrs. Pratt, the butcher's wife, shaking her head. "All that cider, and the way he carried on. Never took proper care of himself. My Harry said only last week he looked fit to burst." Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "The doctor said nothing about a heart attack, nothing at all. Poison, more like, and I know whose hand I'd look at first." "Now, Mrs. Finch." But the words were interrupted by the entry of Miss Jane Marple, neatly dressed in a pale gray coat and straw hat, her gloves clasped round a small basket. She greeted them pleasantly, her mild eyes twinkling. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Pratt. What sad business we had yesterday." There was a sudden hush, followed by a chorus of assent. The women, for all their chatter, respected Miss Marple's quiet dignity. "You were there, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pratt said eagerly. "You saw him fall?" "I did indeed." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "A most distressing occurrence. It is always dreadful when death intrudes upon festivity." Mrs. Finch leaned forward confidentially. "They'll find it was poison. Mark my words. Sir Geoffrey had plenty of enemies. Treated people shameful, he did. Only last month he threatened poor Briggs with eviction." Miss Marple made a gentle sound, halfway between agreement and reflection. "Yes, I noticed a certain tension there. Human nature does dislike humiliation. But then her eyes rested kindly on Mrs. Finch. Resentment does not always lead to violence, does it? One sees so much temper in parishes, yet seldom murder. Mrs. Finch looked momentarily abashed, then rallied. Still, there's always a first time. Miss Marple said nothing further. She selected a small bag of sugar, paid Mrs. Hawkins, and made her way back into the high street. But her mind was busy. Outside, she encountered the vicar's wife, fluttering along with a basket full of knitting wool. "Miss Marple, oh, my dear, how are you this morning? I hardly slept a wink for thinking of it. To die so suddenly, so dreadfully in front of everyone. Caroline was half fainting when she told me you'd helped her home." "Poor Caroline was indeed overcome," Miss Marple said kindly. "But such shocks pass more quickly than one fears. I am concerned for the village, however. Excitement of this kind is apt to unsettle people." Mrs. Prowse nodded. "They're saying all manner of things already. Briggs, of course, he's the favorite suspect. You know how he glared at Sir Geoffrey. And they say he shouted something about paying him back." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must be careful with words spoken in anger. I recall a gardener in St. Mary Mead who swore daily he'd wring the cat's neck, but he never harmed a whisker of it. Still, resentment is a dangerous seed, if left to grow." The vicar's wife shuddered. "You think murder, then?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she glanced down the high street where the police constable was nailing a notice to the board outside the inn. Villagers clustered round to read it. Inspector Graves had ordered that no one was to leave Willowbrook until inquiries were complete. By afternoon, the gossip had spread further. At the inn, men argued over pints of ale. "Briggs did it, no doubt about it," declared Mr. Carter, the blacksmith. "He hated Blunt. Everybody knows that." "Too obvious," muttered another, shaking his head. "Poison, they say. That's not a farmer's way. That's sly work. Well, who else would dare? Who else had cause?" "Half the village had cause," someone retorted grimly. "Blunt cheated, insulted, and bullied his way through life. You'd need more than 2 hands to count his enemies." Miss Marple, who had come in quietly for a pot of tea, sat in the corner by the window, her knitting in her lap. The needles clicked softly as she listened, apparently absorbed in her stitches. She noted carefully the tones of the men, some harsh with anger, others tinged with fear. She observed the innkeeper's nervousness each time Sir Geoffrey's name was mentioned, and the way young Lily, the serving girl, flinched when asked to bring cider. When Miss Marple rose to go, she murmured to herself, "Curious, very curious indeed." That evening, at her cousin Caroline's cottage, supper was a subdued affair. Caroline Pierce, still pale, fussed with her teacup. "I cannot rid myself of the picture, Jane. The way he fell, the dreadful color of him. And to think of Briggs being arrested, well, it seems inevitable, doesn't it?" Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "Inevitable is a dangerous word, Caroline. Life and death are seldom so simple, but everyone says so. Everyone said, too, that poor Mrs. Sims drowned herself in St. Mary Mead when her husband ran off. Yet she had not. She had slipped on the weir. Human tongues, dear, are quick to judgment, but they seldom know the truth." Caroline looked doubtful. "Then you don't believe Briggs did it?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "I have learned that when something appears too obvious, one must look more closely at what lies beneath. Sir Geoffrey was a man who sowed many seeds of resentment. It is human nature, Caroline, and human nature is what I always observe." Outside, the church clock struck 9. The village lay quiet beneath a harvest moon. But behind shuttered windows, speculation ran unchecked. Some prayed for the truth, others feared it. And one among them, Miss Marple knew, was already dreading the gentle, inexorable gaze of an old lady who knitted and listened and saw far too much. The following morning dawned gray and unsettled, a thin mist lying low over the fields beyond Willowbrook. The air held the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke, for villagers had begun clearing their gardens of summer refuse. The church bell tolled 8, solemn and steady, as though marking time since the festival calamity. In the high street, the tension that had been mere gossip the day before now hardened into certainty. Thomas Briggs, the tenant farmer, had been taken for questioning. Mrs. Pratt, the butcher's wife, declared it as fact to anyone who would listen. My nephew saw him marched into the station by Inspector Graves himself. They've been saying for years he'd come to no good, and now look at it. In the grocer's shop, Mrs. Finch spread the news with relish. They found him near the orchard sheds, drunk as a lord, and he was heard shouting, plain as day, that Sir Geoffrey would pay for what he'd done. Well, there's evidence enough for anyone. By the time Miss Marple heard the tale, it had acquired embellishments. A knife was said to have been found in his cottage, though how a knife could be relevant in a poisoning was not explained. He had, apparently, been caught fleeing the festival before Sir Geoffrey collapsed, though Miss Marple herself had distinctly seen him standing glowering by the cider stall at that very moment. Rumor, Miss Marple thought, was as quick as it was inaccurate, and when it combined with the village's natural appetite for certainty, the result could be dangerous indeed. Inspector Graves himself confirmed matters when he visited the vicarage that afternoon. He was a thick-set man with a square jaw and brisk manner, his dark mustache clipped to severity. Seated stiffly, the vicar's parlor, he accepted tea from Mrs. Prowse and spoke in tones of assurance. It's a straightforward case, Mrs. Prowse. The man Briggs bore a grudge against Sir Geoffrey for years. He was on the point of losing his tenancy. He made threats in public. And now Sir Geoffrey is dead, poisoned at the very festival where they quarreled. I've no doubt the magistrates will see it as we do. Mrs. Prowse fluttered her hands. Oh, Inspector, how dreadful! But I suppose justice must be done. Still, he has a wife, you know, and children. Regrettable, Graves said, with a shrug. But we must uphold the law. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, raised her eyes mildly. Forgive me, Inspector, but are you quite certain it was poison? The inspector frowned. Dr. Leonard has sent for analysis, but there's little doubt. The man collapsed in seconds, classic symptoms of some corrosive in the cider. No heart failure, no stroke. Poison, plain as day. And you believe Mr. Briggs had opportunity? Graves's mustache twitched. Of course. He was seen hanging about the cider tent. He had the chance to tamper with the barrels before the judging. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. How very curious. Because I was standing by the vicar's wife at the time, and I distinctly recall Mr. Briggs present at the table when Sir Geoffrey drank. He did not approach the barrels at all. I do hope, Inspector, that you will consider such small details. The inspector gave a short laugh. Details, Miss Marple, are often misleading. One must look at the broad strokes. Motive means opportunity, that is all we need. Ah, yes, said Miss Marple softly. But one must be so very sure one has the right means and the true opportunity. Otherwise, her blue eyes rested gently on him, one may find oneself pursuing the wrong thread altogether. Graves shifted uncomfortably, then stood. Well, we'll see what the analysis says. Good day to you. After he had gone, Mrs. Prowse turned anxiously to Miss Marple. You don't think it could be anyone else, do you? It seems so clear. And Briggs is such a rough man. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, roughness does not always equal guilt. I once knew a gardener in St. Mary Mead, a man who swore daily he'd put weed killer in the squire's tea. Yet it was the squire's charming nephew who did the deed in the end. Human nature is a curious thing. One must look not only at tempers, but at quiet desperation, secret resentments, the little vanities and fears that drive us. That evening Miss Marple walked with her cousin Caroline across the fields. The mist had lifted and the sky glowed faintly with autumnal light. In the distance they saw the Briggs farm, a ramshackle cottage with hens scratching in the yard. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a woman's figure stood at the gate, watching. "That's Mary Briggs," Caroline whispered. "Poor soul. She must be in dreadful anxiety." They drew nearer, and Mrs. Briggs gave them a weary nod. She was a thin woman with hollows beneath her eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Briggs," Miss Marple said gently. "I was most sorry to hear of your husband's trouble." Mary Briggs gave a bitter laugh. "Trouble? They've near hanged him already with their talk. Tom never harmed a soul. He's quick-tempered, aye, but that's words, not deeds. Sir Geoffrey ground him down, these last years, always threatening to put us out. Tom cursed him, true enough, but he never poisoned him." Her voice broke and she turned away. Miss Marple laid a light hand on her arm. "Sometimes, my dear, justice takes a little patience. Truth does not always show itself at once. Have courage." As they walked back toward the village, Caroline said uneasily, "You sounded as though you believe him innocent." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Caroline, I do." There was something in the poor woman's manner, an honesty that does not ring false. Besides, poison is rarely the weapon of men like Briggs. It requires stealth, cunning, a certain, shall we say, domestic subtlety. I should look elsewhere for such qualities. Later, at the cottage, Miss Marple sat before the fire, her needles flashing rhythmically. She thought of the festival again, the nervous maid hovering on the fringe, the doctor's pale face, the postmistress's sharp interest, the way Sir Geoffrey himself had strutted about, taunting and belittling. So many motives, Miss Marple mused. Money, pride, revenge, fear. But who had the calm, deliberate malice to act in such a way? Her ball of wool rolled to the floor, and she bent to retrieve it. As she did, a memory came to her. A girl in Agen, St. Mary Mead, pretty and sweet-faced, who poisoned her rival's dog out of jealousy. Everyone had suspected the gruff gardener who had threatened the animal, but it was the quiet one, the one who smiled and said nothing, who had dropped the meat into the yard. Yes, it was always human nature, repeating itself in pattern after pattern. And in Willowbrook, Miss Marple was certain the true pattern had not yet been discerned. Outside, the autumn night deepened. The village slept uneasily, convinced the murderer was already in custody. Only Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, suspected otherwise. The next morning broke with a chill wind sweeping down from the hills. It rattled the last of the festival bunting until the constable came with a ladder to take it down. The villagers, though outwardly returned to their chores, still moved about with a curious air, half-hushed, half-eager. The murder, for by now most of them used that word freely, had cast a long shadow over Willowbrook. Miss Marple, rising early at her cousin Caroline's cottage, found the breakfast table set with kippers and marmalade. Caroline herself fluttered in with the Daily Chronicle, its front page already hinting at suspicious circumstances at Willowbrook Festival. "They'll have the whole county talking, Jane," she said breathlessly. "How dreadful to see our little village in the papers." Miss Marple buttered her toast with composure. "Newspapers thrive upon sensation, dear. They rarely concern themselves with accuracy. But if one listens to what is said rather than how it is said, the truth will generally peep through." Caroline looked bewildered, but Miss Marple merely sipped her tea. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a call upon Dr. Leonard, the village physician. His surgery was a small room behind his cottage, lined with glass jars and shelves of instruments that looked, to the unpracticed eye, more alarming than comforting. Dr. Leonard himself was pale, his hands betraying a slight tremor as he poured tea for his visitor. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," he said wearily. I examined Sir Geoffrey after his collapse. I've no doubt it was poison. The laboratory will confirm it, I expect, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but penetrating. And yet, doctor, poison does not administer itself. One must ask who had the chance. He rubbed his brow. The police think Briggs. They may be right. Heaven knows, the man threatened Sir Geoffrey openly enough. But not, I think, in that fashion, Miss Marple said gently. Forgive me, but I observed you at the festival, doctor. You looked rather distressed even before Sir Geoffrey fell. The doctor flushed. It was the heat, he muttered. And well, I had reason to dislike the man, if truth be told. He knew of certain indiscretions in my past. He never ceased to remind me. But I swear to you, Miss Marple, I had no hand in his death. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, I believe you, and she did. The fear in his eyes was genuine, but it was the fear of suspicion, not of guilt. On her way back she encountered the maid she had noticed at the festival, a slight, nervous creature named Elsie. The girl was coming from the post office, clutching a parcel. At the sight of Miss Marple she started, nearly dropping it. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "A sad time for you, I fear, after so sudden a loss in your household," Elsie stammered. "Yes, ma'am. Sir Geoffrey was a hard master, but it's terrible, him dying so." Miss Marple's gaze rested gently on her. "You looked frightened that day, Elsie. I wondered why." The girl's eyes widened. I wasn't frightened, ma'am, only there was such a crowd." "I don't like crowds," Miss Marple smiled. "Of course, crowds can be very alarming. But sometimes, you know, it is not the crowd we fear, but a person within it. Still, thank you for speaking to me." Elsie hurried away, leaving Miss Marple with a little more to ponder. That afternoon, in the vicarage parlor, the villagers gathered for what was ostensibly a committee meeting about the church roof. In practice, it was an excuse to exchange theories. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, let the chatter wash over her. Mrs. Finch, leaning forward, declared, "Mark my words, Briggs did it, and if not, then that maid. Shifty she is. Always skulking about. I've seen her slip out of the house when she thought no one noticed." Mr. Carter the blacksmith shook his head. "Poisoning's not a maid's trick. Takes knowledge, that does. More likely someone in the doctor's line." "Don't you dare suggest it," cried Mrs. Prowse, scandalized. "Dr. Leonard is a most respectable man." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes twinkled faintly. Respectability, in her long experience, was often the best disguise. She noted, too, the vicar's wife's recollection of the festival. "I remember," Mrs. Prowse said suddenly, seeing Sir Geoffrey's tankard switched. He put down one, then picked up another. "I thought it odd at the time." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured. "Most interesting." No one else paid much attention, but Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Such a trivial detail, and yet it might prove decisive. Walking home at dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the small things she had observed: the maid's nervous glances, the doctor's secret fear of exposure, the vicar's wife's memory of the switched glass, and most telling, the way certain villagers pressed too eagerly for Briggs's guilt. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was very much like her knitting, full of knots and tangles, but always following a pattern. One had only to discern the right pattern to see the whole design. Caroline met her at the cottage door, anxious as ever. "Well, Jane, what did you discover?" "Nothing conclusive, my dear," Miss Marple said serenely. "Only a collection of odd details. But I find that odd details, properly fitted together, often reveal the most astonishing truths." Caroline shivered. "I wish you would not look so certain, Jane. It makes me fear some dreadful revelation." Miss Marple patted her cousin's hand. Truth is rarely dreadful, Caroline. It is concealment that breeds dread. We shall see. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her needles moving steadily. In her mind she placed each detail as one might fit pieces into a patchwork quilt. The picture was not yet complete, but the outline was beginning to form. And as she set down her knitting and prepared for bed, she murmured to herself, "Poor Briggs, poor foolish inspector. They look too large and too loud. But it is always the small things that matter. Yes, always the small things." The mist of early autumn still hung about Willowbrook the next day, blurring the outlines of cottages and hedgerows, but inside the village the air was sharp with whispers. Rumor had been busy in the night, and by morning it had ripened into revelation. Sir Geoffrey Blunt, once so formidable, was no longer merely dead. He was dissected by the tongues of those who had known him, and the catalogue of his sins grew longer with every retelling. Miss Marple, seated in her cousin Caroline's parlor with her knitting in her lap, listened as Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, delivered the morning's installment. "I can tell you one thing, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch declared, leaning forward. "Sir Geoffrey had debts no gentleman ought to have had. He gambled, you see, cards in London, I've been told. And when the money ran short, he took it from whoever he could squeeze. Why, half the tenants paid more. Then double what the land was worth," Caroline gasped. "I never heard such a thing. He was thought to be wealthy." Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "Appearances, Mrs. Pierce, appearances. He borrowed freely enough from the doctor even." "From Dr. Leonard?" Caroline echoed, scandalized. "Indeed, and when the poor man couldn't pay back at once, Sir Geoffrey held it over him. Blackmail, if you ask me." Miss Marple looked down at her wool, her voice mild. People who hold power over others do not always realize the resentment they breed. Such little humiliations often fester. Mrs. Finch, gratified by agreement, pressed on. "And that's not all. There was trouble with women, too. A certain lady in the next parish, her husband away in the war, you understand. And poor Mrs. Harcourt, Lucy's mother, never forgave him for the way he treated her family over the orchard land." Caroline colored faintly. "I cannot think it well to speak of such things now that the man is gone," but Mrs. Finch only sniffed. "Better to know the truth than to pretend he was a saint. And I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, there are more than a few in Willowbrook who had reason enough to see him gone." When she had swept out, Caroline turned to her cousin with a shiver. "It's dreadful, Jane, all these secrets coming out. Do you really think that almost anyone might have done it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "In villages, dear, one sees how thin is the veneer of civility. Underneath are the same old passions, jealousy, greed, fear. When such things are stirred, it needs only a little push for tragedy to result. Sir Geoffrey, it seems, gave many such pushes." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the Harcourt house, a neat Georgian dwelling with a row of roses, still clinging bravely to the trellis. Mrs. Harcourt received her in the parlor, her hands fluttering at her lace collar. "You've heard, of course, Miss Marple, what they say about Briggs. Poor man, I cannot like him, but I cannot see him as a murderer either. Sir Geoffrey made enemies everywhere. He tried to take our orchard, you know. Would have left us with nothing but the house. If it hadn't been for my late husband's solicitor, we should have been ruined." Her voice sharpened. "I hated him for that. Yes, I confess it. But hatred does not mean I poisoned him." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon her. "No, indeed. But sometimes the sins of one man leave many with bitterness. And bitterness is like frost, it withers more than one garden." Mrs. Harcourt sighed, and her daughter Lucy came in with the tea tray. Lucy's eyes were red from weeping. "You must not think Mamma wished him dead," Lucy said quickly. "It was all years ago. But oh, Miss Marple, it was terrible to see him fall. I shall never forget it." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "One never does forget such sights, my dear. But remember, appearances can be misleading. Death, like life, does not always come from the direction one expects." Lucy looked bewildered, and Miss Marple took her leave, her thoughts busy. At the inn later, Miss Marple paused for her customary pot of tea. The landlord, wiping the counter, leaned across confidentially. "Mark my words, ma'am, it wasn't Briggs. Too hot-headed, that one. Poisoned sly work takes patience. More like someone with a grudge, but clever with it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And who, in your opinion, might that be?" The landlord lowered his voice. "Doctor, maybe. Or that maid of Sir Geoffrey's. She knew things. Always hanging about. I've seen her bring letters to him, letters he didn't want others to read. Burnt some too, in the grate right here in this very inn. You ask me, there's mischief in that quarter." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home, her mind turning over the new morsels of information. Debts, affairs, blackmail, land disputes. The picture was widening, not narrowing. But within such complexity, she knew, lay the single thread that bound it all. That evening, Caroline Pierce fretted over supper. "It grows more dreadful by the day, Jane. To think Sir Geoffrey was such a man. Debts, women, cruelty. I can hardly believe it." Miss Marple sipped her soup serenely. "It is not so uncommon, dear. I remember a churchwarden in St. Mary Mead who was thought the soul of respectability. When he died, it was discovered he had kept a second household in Paddington. No one believed it possible, yet there it was. Human beings are often less simple than they appear." Caroline shuddered. "Do you mean, then, that any one of us might harbor such dreadful secrets?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear Caroline, if one only knew, every parlor holds its skeleton. That is why I always find it wiser to look very closely at the small things people say or do not say. They often tell one more than they intend." Before bed, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire with her knitting. She remembered the way Elsie the maid had flinched when spoken to, the doctor's weary dread, Mrs. Harcourt's bitterness, the postmistress's relish in scandal. So many motives, so many possible hands. And yet the switched tankard lingered in her mind. That small, odd detail seemed to her the key. Someone had changed the cup before Sir Geoffrey drank, someone quiet, unnoticed in the bustle. Miss Marple's needles paused as she murmured softly, "Yes, secrets everywhere. But it is not the loud quarrels one must watch, nor the obvious hatred. It is the small, secretive act that betrays the truth. Always the small act." The following night a strange glow lit the skies above Willowbrook. It began as a faint orange shimmer behind the hedgerows, easily mistaken for sunset at first. But when the church clock had struck 9:30, the shimmer had grown into a ruddy blaze, and the sharp crackle of flames could be heard on the night air. Caroline Pierce, knitting by the fire while Miss Marple dozed gently in her chair, suddenly leapt to her feet. "Jane, look the window." Miss Marple rose with surprising swiftness for her age. From the cottage door they saw the unmistakable sight of a barn aflame, smoke streaming into the night. Bells clanged wildly as the villagers roused themselves. Men ran with buckets, women gathered children, and the whole of Willowbrook seemed drawn toward the blaze. "It's Blunt's old barn," Caroline gasped, "on the edge of the estate." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl with calm precision. How very inconvenient for the dead, one would think, seldom require bonfires. By the time they reached the scene, the barn was half consumed. Sparks flew high, and the heat drove the villagers back despite their frantic efforts with buckets. The roof sagged and collapsed in a shower of embers. The smell of burning hay filled the air. Inspector Graves stood at the edge of the crowd, barking orders. "Keep back. Nothing to be done now. Let it burn itself out." "But, Inspector," cried Mrs. Finch, wringing her hands, "what if there were animals inside?" "There were none," the inspector said curtly. "This barn was disused. Stored odds and ends, that's all. No stock." Miss Marple's keen eyes moved from the barn to the villagers. She noted the faces turned crimson by the glow, the innkeeper pale and sweating, Elsie the maid sobbing quietly into her apron, Dr. Leonard staring fixedly at the flames as though mesmerized. And most curious, the postmistress, Mrs. Finch, wide-eyed with something more than fear, almost triumph. By dawn the barn was nothing but smoldering beams. The villagers, exhausted, drifted home. But when Miss Marple and Caroline passed the site next morning, they found the inspector and his men already there, sifting through the ashes. "What are they searching for?" Caroline whispered. As if in answer, one of the constables lifted a blackened bundle. Paper, half consumed, but still recognizable as letters. The inspector took them, examined the fragments, and turned grimly to his notebook. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, noticing her approach, "this proves it beyond question. The man Briggs tried to destroy evidence. These letters were hidden in the barn, and he set fire to it last night. They concern his rent arrears and threats he made to Blunt, clear as daylight." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you are certain, Inspector, that only Briggs could have had access to the barn?" "Of course. His farm lies nearest. Besides, he's desperate. We'll have him in court before long." Miss Marple bent over one of the charred scraps, her eyes sharp despite the smoke stains. "How curious," she murmured, "that the fire should begin on the very night after Sir Geoffrey's papers were rumored about the village. One might almost think someone wanted them gone." Graves bristled. "That someone was Briggs." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said politely. "But you know, Inspector, in villages one finds that the guilty often prefer others to do their work for them. It is, how shall I put it, a way of keeping one's hands clean." Graves gave a snort and stalked away. Later that day, Miss Marple called at the post office. Mrs. Finch, behind the counter, was unusually flustered. "Terrible, Miss Marple. Simply terrible, that fire. I hardly slept for thinking of it." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Yes, my dear. Fires are upsetting things. They destroy much, but sometimes they reveal, too. I wonder now how it happened the barn contained such interesting letters." Mrs. Finch blinked rapidly. "How should I know? I don't deal in barns." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "only in letters. Jane, everyone says Briggs set the fire. They mean to see him hanged. I'm sure of it. The whole village is talking. And yet, oh, I do so hope you're right that it wasn't him." Miss Marple spooned her soup with quiet deliberation. "It is never wise to hope too much, dear. But I will tell you this. Whoever set that fire did so in a panic. It was not well planned. And panic often comes from those who fear discovery, not from those already accused." Caroline shivered. "You mean someone else burned the barn to destroy evidence?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And in their haste they may have revealed more than they intended." That night, while Caroline slept fitfully, Miss Marple sat by the dying embers of the hearth, her knitting in her lap. Her thoughts went back to the fate, the clatter of Sir Geoffrey's tankard, the nervous maid, the doctor's pallor, the vicar's wife's memory of the switched glass. And now fire, letters, and an inspector too eager to see Briggs guilty. She thought of another case long ago in St. Mary Mead, where a jealous niece had burned a box of old love letters to conceal her aunt's indiscretion. Everyone had suspected the maid, who was seen running from the house. Yet it was the niece who had lit the flame. Human nature did not change, it only repeated itself with new players and new settings. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly once more. "Yes," she murmured. The fire was meant to silence the past. But fire, like gossip, never quite consumes what it is given. There will be ashes enough for truth to rise from. In that smoke lay the whisper of secrets, and Miss Marple knew the village was far from finished with them. Smoke from the barn fire still lingered as villagers gathered over tea, turning whispers into certainty. Mrs. Hawkins spoke of scorched letters. Mrs. Pratt doubted, and Mrs. Prowse shuddered. Miss Marple observed quietly, "Accidents rarely occur when convenient. One must ask who benefits." Mrs. Finch arrived, brisk but nervous, insisting Briggs was guilty. Her rattling cup betrayed unease. Miss Marple reminded them poison was the weapon of quiet hands, not quarrels. Later, Dr. Leonard confided the rinsing jug had stung his fingers, a telling clue. That evening Miss Marple told Caroline, "The inspector's net tightens, but around the wrong fish." The days following the barn fire were filled with a kind of grim certainty. Inspector Graves, confident in his course, moved briskly through the village, taking statements and nodding with official satisfaction each time someone recalled Briggs's quarrels with Sir Geoffrey. To the inspector's mind, the case was sewn up like a neatly tied parcel. Motive, means, and opportunity all pointed one way. And the village, wearied by unease, was only too willing to agree. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hawkins declared it a blessing to have matters so nearly settled. "It shakes one's nerves, all this talk of poison and fire. If it was Briggs, then at least we may sleep again." Mrs. Pratt, the butcher's wife, concurred. "He was always surly, always discontented. I'll not say I'm surprised. A man like that, well, it was bound to end in wickedness." Even Mrs. Prowse, the vicar's wife, though uneasy, confessed to Miss Marple one afternoon, "It seems clear, Jane. The inspector says the laboratory confirmed poison in the cider. And Briggs had threatened Sir Geoffrey so often." Miss Marple, look up. "Yes, dear. People often like to have things finished quickly. But I have noticed that when something is too quickly tidied away, there is usually some little bit of string left dangling." Inspector Graves himself, encountering Miss Marple outside the inn later that day, was in no mood for parables. "Well, Miss Marple, we've got our man. Evidence is stacking like bricks in a wall. The letters, the threats, his opportunity, it all fits." Miss Marple's blue eyes regarded him gently. "I do so admire neat walls, Inspector. But don't you find sometimes that, when a wall is built too quickly, it has a tendency to tumble?" Graves frowned. "You doubt it still? Come now, the man as good as confessed when he shouted those threats. I dare say he lost his head and tampered with the cider in a fit of rage." Miss Marple shook her head. "Rage is noisy, Inspector, but poison is quiet. They do not often go together." The inspector gave a short laugh. "That may be so in St. Mary Mead, madam, but here in Willowbrook, we go by facts, and the facts say Briggs is guilty." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, yet one must ask, why the fire? Why burn the barn unless there was something more than rent arrears? And why now, after Sir Geoffrey's death? A guilty man would be caged by then, not running about with matches." Graves grunted, irritated. "You'll have me chasing shadows, Miss Marple. Leave it to the police." And with that he strode away. That evening Miss Marple sat with Caroline by the fire. The cottage was cozy, the curtains drawn, the kettle singing. Caroline was relieved by the inspector's confidence. "I cannot tell you how much better I feel, Jane, to think it's all but settled. Briggs was a coarse man. If he did such a dreadful thing, then perhaps it's best ended quickly." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "That is precisely what troubles me, Caroline. It is all too quick. In my experience, truth rarely presents itself so obligingly." Caroline frowned. "But the poison, Jane, the letters, the quarrels, it all points to him." "Yes, my dear. But pointing and proving are not the same. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a case where all pointed to the charwoman. Poor creature was nearly driven to despair. Yet it was the daughter of a most respectable family who had done the deed. People saw only what they expected to see. Caroline shivered. "Do you mean, then, that someone else in Willowbrook, someone we know, slipped the poison?" Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. "I should be very much surprised if it were otherwise." The following morning Miss Marple walked into the village, her steps unhurried. She paused at the post office, where Mrs. Finch greeted her with bright eyes. "Well, Miss Marple, it's Briggs right enough, isn't it?" "The inspector as good as said so. A weight off my mind, I can tell you. I never could sleep sound with the murderer about." Miss Marple regarded her mildly. "And yet one still is about, don't you think?" Mrs. Finch looked startled. "Whatever do you mean?" "Only that until truth is found, one cannot sleep so soundly as one imagines. In villages I have known, the real danger often comes not from those suspected, but from those who suspect the least." Mrs. Finch flushed and busied herself with the counter. Miss Marple purchased a reel of cotton and went out into the autumn sunshine. That afternoon she visited Mrs. Briggs, who stood pale but defiant at her cottage door. "They'll not listen to me, Miss Marple," she said bitterly. "Inspector Graves talks as though Tom were guilty already, but he never touched Sir Geoffrey's cider. He never went near it." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "I believe you, my dear, and perhaps it will comfort you to know that truth, like a stubborn plant, has a way of breaking through the soil however heavy the covering." Mrs. Briggs gave a wan smile. "God bless you for saying so. I thought no one believed us." Miss Marple patted her hand and walked away. That evening she sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet street. Lamps glowed behind curtains, smoke curled from chimneys. Outwardly Willowbrook had resumed its placid rhythm. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, fear and suspicion gnawed at the roots. The inspector had cast his net, and the villagers rejoiced to see a culprit caught. But Miss Marple saw that the net was drawn in the wrong part of the stream. The true fish still swam free and perhaps grew, bold with each passing day. She thought again of the switched tankard, of Elsie's frightened eyes, of Dr. Leonard's dread, of Mrs. Finch's too keen relish. Threads, all of them, waiting to be woven. Her knitting needles resumed their steady click. "Human nature," she murmured, "will always betray itself. All one must do is wait and watch and see where the pattern repeats." And so Miss Marple waited. The afternoon sun slanted low across Willowbrook, casting long shadows across the green where only a week ago the harvest festival had been held. Now the square looked deserted, the bright bunting gone. The cider barrels rolled away, and only a trampled patch of grass to mark where merriment had turned to tragedy. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage parlor with Mrs. Prowse, her knitting basket at her side. The needles moved gently, click, click, as she worked a row of fine gray wool. Mrs. Prowse, ever fluttering, poured tea and sighed heavily. "I cannot get over it, Miss Marple. To think of our little village in such dreadful turmoil. Inspector Graves says it's nearly finished, that Briggs will stand trial, but I confess I do not sleep easily. There is something unsettled about it all." Miss Marple gave her a small approving smile. "That is very perceptive of you, dear. It is always wise to trust one's unease. Human nature, you see, whispers to us when something is not quite right." Mrs. Prowse looked bewildered. "But how could one possibly know? It all seems so tangled." Miss Marple's hands never paused in their knitting. "Patterns, Mrs. Prowse. Life is full of patterns, just like knitting. Drop one stitch and it shows, even if the rest is neat. People, too, reveal themselves by small slips. And yesterday I believe I saw one." Mrs. Prowse leaned forward eagerly. "A slip? By whom?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "We were in the grocer's. Mrs. Finch declared she had never known Sir Geoffrey to be generous. Yet later she told me she had once delivered a hamper of cider and hams he had sent to a neighbor as a gift. She had forgotten her own words, you see. It was the haste of a mind trying to hold too many false things at once. The vicar's wife gasped. Do you mean Mrs. Finch knows more than she should? Miss Marple sipped her tea serenely. Perhaps, but one must not leap too quickly. It is always best to let people talk. Gossip, like a loose thread, unravels of its own accord. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Caroline strolled across the lane toward the Harcourt house. Mrs. Harcourt had invited them for tea, and her daughter Lucy, pale but eager to please, ushered them into a parlor heavy with roses and cut-glass vases. Conversation drifted, as it always did, to the festival. Mrs. Harcourt spoke bitterly of Sir Geoffrey's attempts years ago to seize their orchard. Lucy looked distressed. He made enemies of us all, I suppose, Lucy said softly. But I cannot imagine who would really kill him. Briggs, perhaps, but oh, Miss Marple, he seemed almost pleased when it happened. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Yes, my dear. It is often the case that people show too much or too little. Both extremes are worth notice. As they left, Lucy walked them to the gate. Her voice trembled. Mamma is too frank sometimes. She truly hated Sir Geoffrey. But you mustn't think she would never. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. My dear child, hatred is a common thing. It is action that is rare. You need not fear my thoughts on that matter. Lucy looked relieved, though puzzled, and Miss Marple walked on with her cousin. That night, Caroline fussed as she prepared cocoa. Jane, you hint, but you never say directly. Do you mean to tell me you suspect Mrs. Finch? Or Mrs. Harcourt? Or that poor maid Elsie? Miss Marple tucked her knitting neatly away. I do not suspect, Caroline, I observe. And what I observe is this. The tankard was switched, quite certainly, before Sir Geoffrey drank. Only someone calm, unnoticed, would have dared such a thing. Rage and quarrels are too noisy. Poison requires quiet hands and quiet thoughts. Ask yourself who in Willowbrook is best at moving quietly? Caroline stared. But surely not. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We shall see. Patterns reveal themselves only at the end. But I believe the stitch has already slipped. The following morning Miss Marple visited the cottage of Elsie, the maid. She found the girl sitting miserably at a wooden table darning stockings. You mustn't be afraid, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly, after accepting a cup of weak tea. Fear shows? Too plainly, and it makes people wonder what one hides. Elsie burst into tears. I didn't do it, miss. I swear it. Sir Geoffrey was cruel, yes, but I'd never dare such a thing. Only I saw something I daren't tell the police. They'd not believe me. Miss Marple's eyes grew keen. And what was that, child? Elsie whispered. It was Mrs. Finch. I saw her by the cider tent when everyone else was dancing. She had no business there. She slipped away quick when Sir Geoffrey came. Miss Marple patted her hand. You did right to tell me. Sometimes the smallest observation proves most important. That evening Miss Marple sat once more with the vicar's wife. She told a little parable as her needles clicked. In St. Mary Mead we once had a case of jam jars gone missing. Everyone blamed the village boys. But I noticed one lady never joined the gossip. She was too eager to look innocent. And when I remarked, quite idly, that the missing jars had peculiar lids, she started so violently that she betrayed herself. She had taken them to use for preserving fruit. Human nature always shows itself by small starts and slips. Mrs. Prowse, puzzled but fascinated, asked, And in Willowbrook who is starting and slipping? Miss Marple smiled gently. We shall know very soon, my dear. Very soon indeed. That night, as the autumn wind rattled the shutters, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. Her mind was quite clear. The gossip of the village, the fire in the barn, the switch tankard, the trembling maid, the vicar's wife's small memory, all fitted together. She knew now the nature of the hand that had slipped poison into Sir Geoffrey's drink. Only one thing remained: to test the pattern, to tug at the last loose stitch and see if the fabric came undone. Her pale eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "Yes," she murmured, "the pattern is there. And tomorrow, perhaps, we shall begin the unraveling." The next afternoon Miss Marple set her plan into motion. She did it with her usual mildness, so that no one suspected anything at all. A few quiet words here, a gentle suggestion there, and by tea-time the vicarage parlor was arranged just so: a polished table laid with scones and sandwiches, the best china cups at each place, and a pot of strong Darjeeling set ready to pour. Mrs. Prowse fluttered anxiously about the room. "Jane, my dear, are you quite certain it's wise to have them all here? There's so much ill feeling. And what if it grows unpleasant?" Miss Marple smiled serenely as she adjusted her knitting bag by the armchair. "My dear, a village tea is never unpleasant. People say things at tea they would never say elsewhere. That is why tea is such an excellent occasion for truth." By 4:30 the guests began to arrive. Dr. Leonard came first, pale and harassed, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Mrs. Harcourt followed, tall and imperious, with poor Lucy at her side looking wan. Then came Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, brisk and rosy-cheeked, speaking a little too loudly about the weather. Lastly, to everyone's surprise, Inspector Graves himself, persuaded by Miss Marple's gentle insistence, appeared at the door. "It's highly irregular," he muttered, settling his bulk into a chair. "But if it pleases you, Miss Marple—" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said mildly, pouring tea. "I do think we all need a little comfort in these difficult days." The conversation began in halting, polite tones. The doctor spoke of influenza in the district, Mrs. Harcourt of the price of coal, Mrs. Finch of the post's unreliability. Miss Marple nodded and smiled, offering scones, letting the talk run where it would. Only when the cups were half drained did she steer it, as gently as a hand on a rudder, toward the subject that mattered. "Such a pity about the harvest festival," she said softly, threading her needles as though the thought were idle. "It should have been remembered for prize marrows and cider, not tragedy." There was a murmur of agreement. Mrs. Finch clucked sympathetically. "A terrible thing indeed. But at least the inspector has his man." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "The evidence is sound, I assure you. Briggs will answer for it." Miss Marple's eyes stayed fixed on her knitting. "I wonder. You know, I was thinking of the cider. Such a curious thing, the way Sir Geoffrey's tankard was switched. Mrs. Prowse remembers it very clearly." At once Mrs. Finch's teacup rattled in its saucer. She gave a quick laugh. "Oh, I dare say in the confusion people imagine things." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Perhaps. And yet, the smallest detail can be telling. I remember a fete at St. Mary Mead when a young man switched a prize cake for another. Everyone thought it a trifle, but it turned out to show quite a lot about his character." Mrs. Finch flushed. "Cakes and poison aren't the same thing, Miss Marple." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But the hand that switches one thing may be equally ready to switch another. And when that hand belongs to someone accustomed to handling letters, well, one begins to think." A silence fell. The doctor shifted uneasily. Mrs. Harcourt pursed her lips. Inspector Graves frowned. Miss Marple set down her knitting with delicate precision. "You see, it was never Briggs. Briggs blustered and shouted, but poison is not the weapon of the blustering. It is the weapon of the sly, the cautious, the one who prefers to act quietly while others look elsewhere." Mrs. Finch gave a sharp cry. "You can't mean—" But Miss Marple's voice flowed on, calm and inexorable. "Sir Geoffrey had letters that compromised others. They were hidden in that barn. and someone, in fear, set a fire to destroy them. Only the guilty act in such panic. And I know, Mrs. Finch, that you were near the cider tent when all thought you busy elsewhere. Elsie saw you." The postmistress's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed shrilly. "Nonsense. Idle gossip. I was nowhere near." But Miss Marple's eyes, pale and steady, never wavered. "My dear, you forget I have lived too long not to recognize fear. It shows in the small things, your trembling when poison was mentioned, your eagerness to declare Briggs guilty, your slip about Sir Geoffrey's generosity. You betrayed yourself, as human nature always does, in the tiniest detail." Mrs. Finch half rose from her chair, her hands clenched. Then, as if her strength gave out, she sank back. Tears welled in her eyes. "He would have ruined me," she whispered hoarsely. "Those letters he had proof I'd taken money from the postal accounts years ago, just a little to cover a debt. I meant to repay it. But he found out. He laughed, said he'd have me dismissed, disgraced. My husband ill, my children hungry, and he laughed. What was I to do? Inspector Graves sat thunderstruck. Good Lord, are you confessing?" Mrs. Finch sobbed. "I only meant to stop him. Just a drop in his cider so he'd be sick. Not to kill him outright. But then he fell and I couldn't think. The letters, I had to burn them before anyone found them." The room held silence save for the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her face grave. "You see, Inspector," she said gently, "it was never rage or hatred that killed Sir Geoffrey. It was fear. Fear." Inspector Graves rose heavily, his face grim. "I'll have to take her in, of course. God knows, I never suspected." He turned to Miss Marple. "You saw what none of us did." Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. "Not saw, Inspector, only listened. Human nature repeats itself, you know, and one only has to notice the pattern." That evening, back at Caroline's cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire. Caroline was pale with shock. Jane, to think it was Mrs. Finch, of all people. Why? She always seemed so bustling and reliable. How dreadful to imagine her slipping poison into a cup at the fete. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "Yes, dear, dreadful but not surprising. I have learned that wickedness often wears the cloak of respectability. The very people one trusts to be dependable are sometimes those most desperate to conceal a secret. Sir Geoffrey sowed fear wherever he went, and it is fear that breeds desperate acts." Caroline shivered. "I shall never post a letter again without thinking of it." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving gently. "Perhaps that is no bad thing, Caroline. It does us good to remember how much harm can lie in small, ordinary things, a tankard, a letter, a spoon of cider. Life is made of such small things. And so is death." The fire crackled. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the hedges. The trap had been set, the truth revealed. Yet in Miss Marple's eyes there was no triumph, only a quiet sadness for the folly of human nature endlessly repeating itself. Inspector Graves returned to the vicarage the following morning with a look of chastened resolve. The news had already run its course through Willowbrook like a swift brook after rain. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress so brisk, so reliable, had been taken into custody. People spoke in hushed voices at gates and in shops, as though the mere loudness of speech might dislodge the fragile order that had at last been restored. Miss Marple had asked for one more gathering, a last tea in the vicarage parlor before life resumed its ordinary rhythm. It was to be a quieter affair than the previous day's confrontation, no trap this time, only the patient laying out of a pattern. Inspector Graves agreed, perhaps from gratitude, perhaps because even policemen require tidiness of the mind. Dr. Leonard came, pale but steadier. Mrs. Harcourt and Lucy sat together, the former stiff, the latter sorrowful. And Mrs. Prowse, though shaken to the core, poured tea with trembling dignity. Miss Marple, comfortable in her chair with her knitting beside her, began in that mild, unhurried voice which had, in the last few days, proved stronger than any shout. "I think," she said, "that we shall all rest easier when we understand how very simple the matter was. Simple, that is, if one remembers that fear is the most practical of tutors. Mrs. Finch was not a woman of grand imagination. She was a woman of habit who had found herself cornered." Inspector Graves inclined his head. "She has given a statement," he said hoarsely, "but it is confused." "If you please, Madam set it out plainly." Miss Marple smiled. "With pleasure, Inspector. Let us begin where the pattern begins, before the festival, not at it. Sir Geoffrey, for some time, had kept certain letters which, had they been known, would have cost Mrs. Finch her position and good name. The letters were stored among other papers in the old barn on the Blunt estate, an untidy habit in a man who relished power but disliked housekeeping. Mrs. Harcourt gave a small sound of distaste. "He was careless with all that was decent," she murmured. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "but his carelessness had a purpose. Disorder is often a convenient fog." Now Mrs. Finch had long known he possessed the means to ruin her. She had begged, promised repayment, even threatened to expose his usury and bullying. But she had no proof others would dare to believe, and in any case she feared scandal. The festival offered an opportunity not planned over. Months but seized in a moment. A crowded green, many hands pouring and passing, and Sir Geoffrey's own love of pomp. Dr. Leonard cleared his throat. "But how, if I may ask, was the poison put into the cider? The analysis shows a strong dose." "Ah," Miss Marple said, "that is the crux, isn't it?" Everyone looked to the judging table, to the lifted tankard, and so imagined the fatal moment occurred there. But I think the dose was prepared earlier, where eyes were fewer, the preparation tent. There was a jug used to rinse cups and top up samples. No one guards a rinsing jug. It is too humble. Mrs. Prowse, she turned kindly to the vicar's wife. "You mentioned seeing Sir Geoffrey set down one tankard and take up another just before he drank?" "I did," Mrs. Prowse said, surprised to be remembered. "I thought I had imagined it. Not at all. That was the final flourish of a man who loved display, to the glory of Willowbrook cider," he cried. But the true harm was already done. A little of the strong solution, easily dissolved, would have lingered where it could be introduced unnoticed into whichever cup Sir Geoffrey took up. It is not so difficult, in the bustle of a fete, to pass a moistened spoon or to swirl a jug. The important point is that the deed required quiet hands, not a loud quarrel. Inspector Graves frowned. But why the switching of the tankard at all, if the poison had already been placed? "To ensure," Miss Marple said, "that Sir Geoffrey drank from a cup touched by the prepared jug rather than by chance. The switch looked like confusion. But for the guilty, confusion is often an ally. One must admire, in a mournful way, the economy of it. A small action, hidden in a sea of small actions." Lucy, who had been very still, whispered, "And the maid Elsie, who said she saw Mrs. Finch by the tent." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear." Elsie's was a small observation, and small observations are the gold, dust of truth. Mrs. Finch had a reason to be where she had no business. She handled letters all day, every day. She knew how to slip in and out, to be present without notice. That is a discipline, and fear makes such discipline useful. Graves rubbed his jaw. "The fire in the barn," he muttered. "I should have seen it then. Panic, as you say. Panic," Miss Marple agreed. The act of a woman who, after the shock of the death, realized that because of her fear, the letters must be destroyed. She waited until the village slept, then struck a match. But panic ruins the very caution it intends to serve. Some letters survived. More importantly, the timing itself betrayed her. Why burn after a man was dead, if not to efface a connection to him? Dr. Leonard looked at his hands. And my part, Miss Marple? I confess I have dreaded even the mention of those letters. Sir Geoffrey knew of my debt. He baited me with it. I feared the inspector would conclude I had silenced him. Miss Marple's gaze was grave but kind. You feared what bullies intend you to fear, Doctor, the loss of reputation. It is very common, especially among those who think themselves respectable. Mrs. Finch feared it too, and so she acted. You merely paled and trembled, which is the harmless excess of conscience. Forgive me, but in my experience the truly guilty seldom tremble until they are found out. There was a faint ripple of rueful laughter, quickly subsiding. Outside the parlor window the autumn sunlight lay tenderly over the vicarage garden. The roses, though fading, still held a late sweetness. Mrs. Harcourt spoke suddenly, bitterness drained from her voice. And Briggs? What of him? He will be cleared? Entirely, Miss Marple said. Briggs threatened, yes. But threats in the open are often a safety valve. He blusters. He drinks. He sleeps. Poison is not for men who shout. The inspector's net was cast where the splashing was loudest. It is a natural error, and one our little world encourages, for we like to think vice goes about in heavy boots. It does not. It tiptoes. Inspector Graves flushed, then gave a curt nod. You are right, Miss Marple. I allowed convenience to dress itself as certainty. I'll set the matter right today. Mrs. Prowse dabbed at her eyes. The children, she murmured. Mrs. Finch's children, Miss Marple's expression softened. There is tragedy in every tidy conclusion, Mrs. Prowse. One pities the offender, even while acknowledging the offense. In St. Mary Mead, when a lady stole from the church funds to keep a feckless nephew, we were grieved for her as much as for the money. But grief does not turn falsehood into truth. We must do what is just, and then be as kind as we may. There was a silence, a decent, thoughtful silence, broken only by the chime of the mantel clock. Inspector Graves rose as if to conclude the meeting, but Miss Marple raised a small gloved hand. One more thing, if I may. You will have noticed that every thread in this sad tapestry leads back to one loom, Sir Geoffrey's delight in holding power over others. He enjoyed threatening, humiliating, and collecting secrets as though they were trophies. The village accommodated him because it seemed easier to endure one bully than to endure public scandal. That is a mistake many parishes make. We call our patience prudence and our silence charity. Yet, in truth, we nourish fear. It is fear that ripens into wickedness. Dr. Leonard bowed his head. Then it was we who fed the flame. Not you alone, Miss Marple said. But yes, each of us in our degree. The remedy is very old-fashioned, I'm afraid. Honesty and a little courage. A church fate, like a parish, requires both if it is to remain cheerful. Lucy's eyes shone with sudden tears. You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple. It is only simple at the end, Miss Marple replied. At the beginning, it is knots and tangles. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. I shall see to Briggs immediately. He is to be released at once. As for Mrs. Finch, the charge will be laid. Your account, Miss Marple, accords with what she managed to stammer last night. We will, of course, confirm the matter of the rinsing jug and tankards. You will find, Miss Marple said, a stain on the lip of the jug where the solution was poured, though much rinsing will have been done since. And if you look among the remains in the barn, a small tin the sort chemists use for powders may be rescued from the ashes. Fire does not always consume metal. It was an amateur's method, hasty, frightened, and alas, sufficiently effective. Graves scribbled in his notebook, then paused. Miss Marple. I find I must concede that your method, what you call human nature, is sharper than our procedures when a village is concerned." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Your procedures are excellent for men who break windows or steal motor cars, Inspector. But in villages, sin is a domestic creature. It curls itself in teapots and hides under tablecloths. One must know parlors as well as prisons." There was, this time, a gentler ripple of laughter. The tea had cooled. The shadows in the room had lengthened. The vicar's wife, with the instinct of a hostess, rose to freshen the pot, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear, I think we have drunk enough for today." They dispersed quietly. Mrs. Harcourt touched Miss Marple's hand and, after a moment's struggle, said, "Thank you." Dr. Leonard, more composed, offered a short, heartfelt bow. Lucy squeezed Miss Marple's fingers impulsively like a child. Miss Marple patted them, pleased and a little sad. When all had gone, Caroline came in from the passage, where she had lingered in agitation. "Jane," she said, "to hear you tell it, well, it was as though a fog lifted and one saw the village plainly for the first time. Is it always like this, do you think? Good people frightened into badness by the threat of shame?" Miss Marple considered. "Not always, dear, but often enough. In parishes, we grow vines of respectability over the front of our houses, and suppose the foundations are strong because the leaves are green. Small tremor and unpaid bill, a foolish letter, and cracks appear. Sir Geoffrey made a profession of tapping at those cracks with his cane." Caroline shivered. "I shall be glad when you are safely back in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple smiled. "And I, when Willowbrook's bells ring for nothing more serious than evensong." She took up her knitting and worked a few quiet rows. Outside, the faint murmur of the village drifted. Through the open window, a barrow creaking, a child calling, the clip of a bicycle on the lane. It was an ordinary music again. The pattern, however painful, was complete. Miss Marple set her needles down and looked into the fire. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "the village will begin to forget. It is well that it should, but not entirely. A little memory is the price of peace." And with that, the old lady settled back, as calm as a pond at dusk, while Willowbrook's long, troubled week finally inclined toward rest. Sunday morning dawned bright and cold. The air scented faintly with wood smoke and fallen leaves. The bells of St. Mary's rang out across Willowbrook, their measured peal reminding the village that, whatever turmoil had visited them, life and time moved steadily on. The villagers came to church in twos and threes, their voices subdued. Women wore darker coats than usual, men brushed their Sunday suits carefully, and children were warned into unusual quiet. Inside the nave, the air was heavy with beeswax and chrysanthemums, the flowers placed in memory of the season's harvest. Yet there was a hush quite apart from worship, the hush of a community scarred by scandal. Mrs. Prowse fussed with hymn books, pale but determined. Caroline Pierce sat with her cousin, Miss Marple, who looked as placid and unassuming as ever in her neat gray hat. Inspector Graves occupied a pew near the back, stiff and uncomfortable, as though the solemnity of the service pressed on him harder than any courtroom. During the prayers, a murmur ran briefly through the congregation when Mrs. Finch's name was spoken among those requiring intercession. Some bowed their heads with pity, others with disapproval. But all listened, all remembered, and in their hearts all reckoned with the unsettling truth that the village's own postmistress had proved a poisoner. Afterwards, outside on the church green, the congregation lingered uneasily, as they always did. Yet instead of the usual chatter about gardens or preserves, conversations faltered, eyes slid away, and whispers carried across the crisp air. The news was already certain. Briggs had been released, vindicated, though sullen in his relief. Mrs. Finch remained in custody, awaiting trial. Miss Marple moved gently among them, receiving nods and cautious smiles. She listened more than she spoke, as was her habit, but her presence seemed to calm where otherwise gossip might have flown. Dr. Leonard approached her, hat in hand, his manner more composed than it had been in weeks. "Miss Marple, I feel I must thank you. If not for your intervention, I believe I should have lived under suspicion the rest of my life. A doctor cannot practice with that shadow." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "No thanks are needed, doctor. You see, guilt shows itself by action, not merely by fear. I never mistook yours for anything more than anxiety." He bowed gratefully and moved on, leaving Miss Marple with Caroline. "Jane," her cousin whispered, "do you think the village will ever forget?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Villages forget quicker than they think, Caroline, but never entirely. The talk will soften. Pity will grow where scandal burns out. But there will always be a memory like a faint scar on smooth skin." In the days that followed, Willowbrook slowly returned to its rhythm. The post office stood shuttered, a young clerk from the next town filling in. Briggs went about his farm, scowling but free, while his wife held her head high, though she avoided the high street where whispers followed. Mrs. Harcourt resumed her duties in the Women's Institute, Lucy at her side, the shadow of bitterness dulled by shared relief that the ordeal was past. The vicarage, too, quieted. Mrs. Prowse busied herself with choir practice and roof repairs, though she often sighed, murmuring, "To think of poor Mrs. Finch! How dreadful for the children!" Miss Marple, listening, would nod sympathetically. "Yes, my dear. And yet, dreadful too that fear should drive one to destroy herself in such a way. Fear is a root that bears bitter fruit." Caroline fretted over every morsel of gossip, but Miss Marple moved serenely through it all, offering neither condemnation nor excuse, only the calm of one who had seen too many such tragedies to be surprised. One afternoon, Inspector Graves himself called at Caroline's cottage. He looked awkward in the cozy parlor, perched on the edge of a chair while Miss Marple poured tea. "I felt I must come," he said, to say. "Well, I misjudged. I see now that I clutched too quickly at the obvious. Briggs's temper blinded me. I was certain of him, and in that certainty I nearly let the real culprit escape. You were right, Miss Marple. Poison is never the tool of rage." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "It is very human, Inspector, to want matters settled quickly. Villagers do the same. We tell ourselves a tidy story because it spares us from facing a more unsettling truth. But truth is seldom tidy. That is why one must look at the small things." He sighed. "You saw what I could not." "Not saw," Inspector noticed. "I have lived too long in villages not to see how human nature repeats itself. A quarrelsome farmer blusters. A respectable postmistress hides her fear until it bursts out in some. A week later, the harvest festival was spoken of less often. The green looked bare now, the grass trampled but recovering. Children played once more by the duck pond, their shrieks of laughter carrying where once cries of horror had rung. The rhythm of life, so resilient, so stubborn, resumed its beat. On her last evening in Willowbrook, Miss Marple sat by Caroline's fire. The knitting lay finished beside her, a neat gray shawl, the pattern simple but exact, no stitches dropped. Caroline admired it, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "I cannot help but pity her, Jane," she said softly. "Mrs. Finch, I mean. A woman so ordinary, so much like ourselves. To think she carried such a dreadful fear all those years, and that it led her to this." Miss Marple folded the shawl with care. "Yes, dear. Fear is the strongest of motives. Stronger even than greed, stronger than passion. I have known it drive a mother to harm her child, a wife to betray her husband, a clerk to ruin himself for a single false account. Respectability makes fear worse. It leaves no room for confession. Mrs. Finch was desperate to preserve her good name, and so she lost it entirely. Caroline shivered. "I shall be glad to see you back in St. Mary Mead, Jane. I feel as though death still lingers in the air here." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes thoughtful. "Death lingers everywhere, Caroline. In cottages, in villages, in cities. But so does life. The balance is always delicate. That is why it is important to notice the little things, the way people look, the words they choose, the silences they keep. In those small things, one may see both the weakness and the hope of human nature." The clock ticked softly. Outside, the night was very still. The next morning Miss Marple took her leave. The villagers gathered politely to wish her farewell. Mrs. Prowse with moist eyes, Lucy Harcourt with a shy smile, even Briggs with a gruff nod of gratitude. The vicar shook her hand warmly, and Inspector Graves, stiff but respectful, tipped his hat. Caroline clung to her cousin's arm until the last moment. "You must come again, Jane, though perhaps not at festival time." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Yes, dear. Festivals are better without fatalities." As the train carried her away from Willowbrook, Miss Marple gazed out at the passing fields and hedges, her expression serene. Another village, another pattern, another tangle of folly and fear. Always the same, always different. She folded her hands, and in her mind the words shaped themselves, gentle and firm. Life returns to its rhythm. But human nature, being what it is, will always provide new tangles for some old woman to unravel. One must only watch, listen, and remember. And Miss Marple, with a faint smile, closed her eyes as the train rattled on towards St. Mary Mead, leaving Willowbrook to its peace and its scars.